Today we want to pick up a thread that kind of emerged last week in the middle of the talk on theory, practice, and consistency. And this is the idea of the seven main aspects of God. Now, where it came out last week, what we were talking about was we were talking about our practice, our spiritual practice. And I used the example of Moses going to the well, and there were seven sisters there. And in the symbolism, as I understand it, in the symbolism of the Bible, they represent the seven main aspects of God. We're going to talk about one set of definitions of what those seven might be. And one of the sisters approached Moses. She was friendlier than the others. She came to him, and he fell in love with her. He married her, Miriam, and she was the daughter of the priest. So this whole scenario, this whole setting, this story in the Bible is a teaching story. Moses felt that he was called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, the land of confusion, the land of suffering. Right? And again, this is a teaching story. This is a parable. Whether there's archaeological evidence that this ever really happened or not is not the point. It is talking to us about spiritual things, but it is painting a picture for us that we can understand. And more importantly, it is painting a picture that the people for whom the books were written and by whom the books were written, that they understood. And we're going back here thousands of years later, and we're trying to interpret things. You know, we're looking at things and saying, oh, well, that's what that means, because today it has that meaning. May not have had the same meaning that we have today thousands of years ago. But nevertheless, in the desert we have this deep well, right? This fountain of life, the source of life in the desert. And the deep wells usually symbolize going to a deeper level of consciousness. So Moses is going to a deeper level of consciousness. He's making his approach to God, which is symbolized by the daughter of the priest. And there's one daughter that is friendlier to him than the rest. There is one aspect of God that is easier for us to accept, to work with, to grow with than the rest. And this is what we were talking about in terms of our practice. Find that aspect of God which is friendliest to you, which is easiest for you to stay with and to work with. That's the one that you're going to stay with, you know. And it's like when we talk about meditation, there's so many different techniques for meditation. You just have to find the one that you're going to stay with, and stay with that until it doesn't work for you anymore, until you get bored with it, and then find another. But find the one that's easiest. That's the one you're going to stay with. And then there's one that's going to be difficult. And that's the one that's going to represent for you the most growth. So there's a story of a teacher in the East that students would come to him and say, oh, we heard you're such a great teacher and a great guru, and that you can help us reach enlightenment, and we want you to do that. We want you to take us and help us to move forward enlightenment. I would say enlightenment is our conscious awareness of the presence and the activity of God. Same as revelation in Christianity. So the guru would say to the student, what is the one thing that you were most afraid I would tell you that you had to do to reach enlightenment? And whatever they said, whatever their answer was, he said, go do that. Go do that. And it was just that simple. There was something within them that was resisting their greatest growth. And he would have them go do that. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind, that what we're talking about is we're talking about finding our approach to God, finding our our handle, if you will, a way that we can grasp onto God into some tangible way. Remember, we're talking about intangible ideas. We're talking about principles. Principles are not tangible. You can't see the principle, you can see the effect of it. You can't see gravity, but you can see things drop to the ground when you let them out of your hand. There's a principle, there's an invisible something there behind them. And this whole concept of what God might be is abstract. And that's why I say the very word God itself is insufficient. It is not, it doesn't do justice. It as a word, it is an audible symbol of an idea, but even the best and the highest idea that our human consciousness can conceive of as God is incomplete, is inadequate. It is beyond words. Right? The Upanishads tell us that which is beyond words, but from which words come, that which is beyond thoughts, but from which thoughts come. Perhaps the best way that I can find to think of it also comes from the East. And Dr. Holmes told us that that some of the best organized thoughts on spirituality came from the East. They're older ideas. They've been around for thousands and thousands of years. But in some traditions there, the prayers start with, "O ineffable one, O ineffable one." So we're probably used to hearing prayers in our culture where we would say, "Our Father." And Father has a certain connotation to us, a certain definition. And yet God is beyond definitions. Undefinable, ineffable. There aren't words to adequately describe. So we stumble with our vocabulary. And mind you, our vocabulary now is much, much larger than it was thousands of years ago. I've heard it said that the Aramaic language that was spoken in Palestine at the time that Jesus lived there was about 4,000 words. That was it. So each word had several different meanings. And it was the context in which the word was used that helped the listener to figure out exactly which meaning the speaker was intending. And to make matters even more difficult, in the written language, they didn't write down the vowels like we have A, E, I, O, and U. Now, languages had those sounds, but the written symbols that we have, A, E, I, O, U, they didn't have. So the way that they, in writing, would indicate the sound of a vowel was they would put a dot or a dash, a dot or a jittle. Jittle, yeah, I think so. Over or under the letter. And that would kind of help the reader to determine what vowel sound was being used and where it would go. All of which is simply to say that words as audible symbols of our thoughts are completely inadequate when it comes to trying to understand what this thing that, for lack of a better word, we will call God is. And even the best idea that we might have is not adequate. Our best idea is not God. Our best idea is only our idea of God. And this is why, January of every year, this is why the first talk that we give of every year is always about, what is your idea of God? What is your concept of God? Because it is that concept of God that is going to define your entire life. I would like you to consider that what your life consists of, the experiences that your life consists of, is largely what you accept and expect as normal. It is done unto us according to our belief. So our growth, our spiritual growth then, is moving, for lack of a better way to say it, moving beyond our ideas of limitation. But it's really moving before our ideas of limitation. And maybe a way to describe it is sunlight shining through a prism. So you can take a prism and you can hold it so that the light shines through it, and you'll get a rainbow on the other side. Interestingly enough, that rainbow has 7 colors. Now, the ideas that we have of lack or limitation or of sickness or of disease or of obstruction or any of those things, they all exist on the side of the prism where the light is scattered, where the light is broken out into its 7 main components, or 7 aspects of light, if you want to call them that. But back on the other side of the prism, there's no confusion. There's no obstruction. There's no delay. There's no limitation. There's no sin. There's no sickness. There's no death. There's none of those things. And our idea of God, our concept of God, is also on that side of the prism where the light is scattered, where the light is dispersed. We're trying to look from our side of the prism, looking through a glass darkly, as Paul the apostle said. We're trying to look back through that prism and gain a comprehension of what that pure white light might be. That's what we're trying to do. This number 7 keeps coming back to us in the culture of both the Old and the New Testament. It's used very, very much in the book of Revelation, which is a book of symbolism. And there we have 7 lampstands, oil lamps, 7 lampstands. Again, the 7 main aspects of God. And in that culture, the number 7 represented completeness or fullness or wholeness. So if we said the 7 lampstands, we meant the totality of what God is. When we say 7 main aspects of God, we mean the totality of what God is. When Moses met the 7 sisters at the well, the totality of what God is. But because this concept is so abstract to us, because it is literally impossible for us to get our mind around that which is ineffable, we have to break it down into bite-sized pieces. It's like the old saying about how to eat an elephant. 1 bite at a time. You have to break it down to bite-sized pieces. We have to try to find an approach to God that works for us. The example I sometimes use is the handle with the suction cup at each end that you'll see the glaziers use it when they're moving a big pane of glass off of the truck. They put these suction cups on there, and they move able to get a handle on that which otherwise they couldn't hold. So we are each individually kind of trying to get a handle, get a grasp on that which is in itself beyond our grasp. But we're trying to find a way. We're trying to find a way for us that works, a way that we can have a starting place. And even in what we consider to be our starting place, we have to recognize that it's only a beginning. It's only a beginning. So if I said to you, well, God is love, and everybody would nod their heads knowingly, yes, God is love. Well, what does that really mean to you? And that's only a beginning, because that's only one of the aspects of God. And God is more than that. God is the totality. God is. So Emmet Fox wrote this little pamphlet called The 7 Main Aspects of God. You can find it out on the internet. There are people on YouTube who are reading it. There are several sites where they have reprinted it all or in part. It was just a little pamphlet, and I think at the time that we first got it, it was like $1. And now on Amazon, they're $10 if you want to buy a used copy. I think it's 48 pages, and it was just a little pamphlet, a little tiny booklet, one that would fit in your shirt pocket. 48 pages long, but it's kind of packed with thought-provoking ideas. And the interesting thing is Emmet Fox was trying to take what Thomas Troward taught and make it more accessible. That's kind of what he felt his role as a teacher was. Thomas Troward also talks about the 7 main aspects of God, and he uses different language. He uses different words. And we have to keep in mind that this idea of defining the 7 aspects, it's kind of like looking at the ocean and trying to decide, well, is this the Atlantic or the Arctic? You know, it looks pretty much the same. So there's an overlap. There's an overlap, and then there's a blending. And again, go back to the idea of the prism. Go back to the one pure light that is shining through the prism, and it's broken out into seven distinct colors. And yet you can take some of those colors, and you can see a little bit of one color in the other. You know, you might be able to see that within the violet there is a blue in there. There's kind of a blending. And then you can take other colors and you can mix them together, and you can get different colors still. So while you get 7 colors through the prism, if you go to your computer and you pull up your color palette, you know, you have many more colors, depending upon how many bits your machine has and how many bits the program uses, how many your monitor is capable of displaying. So there's different shades, there's different mixtures, there's different shades. And that's okay. We just have to keep that in mind, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to find that particular shade, that particular aspect of God that appeals to us the most, and we are trying to follow that thread, trying to follow that back through the prism. And in my example today, I'll say the prism is the human consciousness, the race consciousness, what we expect and accept as normal. We're trying to get beyond that. We're trying to get to the other side of that. We're trying to get to that stillness, to the place where simply God is. Excuse me, I had to get another drink of water. Throat is very dry here today. So what we want to consider, a couple things. Again, we have a parable from the East of the 4 men who couldn't see. Perhaps they were blindfolded. They couldn't see, and they discovered an elephant. And each had a different part of the elephant, and each had a different opinion as to what an elephant was like. You know, one had a hold of the elephant's legs and said the elephant is like a tree trunk. And another had the elephant's tail, and he said, no, an elephant is like a rope. And one had the elephant's trunk and said, no, the elephant is like a big snake. And one had his hands against the side of the elephant, and he said, no, the elephant is like a wall. That's what the elephant is like. And they were each right in their own limited perspective, but none of them could see the big picture. None of them could take in the totality of what the elephant was. And the reason that story is told is that each of us is like one of those 4 men. Each of us is trying to discern what God is, but we're each doing it from a limited perspective. That's one point. The other thing that we want to keep in mind is whatever we perceive to be in our lives as a problem, it is an area where an aspect of God is limited by our consciousness. So, for example, disease is lack of ease. So you might think then, so on the one side of the prism, we've got everything which includes ease, and that pure light is coming through the prism of our consciousness, but somehow the ease is blocked. It's not getting through. So if we look on our side of the prism, we see disease. On the other side of the prism, there is none. Now, how do we get rid of the disease? You know, we can't take an eraser and erase what really isn't there, right? So it's not that the disease is real, it's that the ease is blocked, or our natural health is blocked. The natural health of our body is in some way blocked or restricted. So healing then comes in terms of restoring that which is naturally there, which is the health. It is returning the ease, which is the normal natural condition of the body. So I think it's important that we keep that in mind, because we can get so caught up in trying to fight the symptoms, whatever the symptoms might be in our lives, whether they be lack, whether they be limitation, whether they be disharmony. It doesn't matter. We get so caught up in fighting the symptoms that we realize that the more we fight them, the more power we are giving them. The more we are getting stuck into them, the more we are getting embroiled with them. And what we want to do is we want to recognize that if there is a condition in our lives that seems to need restoring or healing, whether it be a physical condition, a financial condition, a relationship condition, a work condition, doesn't matter. Whatever it is that we seem to be experiencing difficulty with, well, that's an area where we need to let more of a certain aspect of God into our lives. So Emmet Fox will tell us, first of all, that what changes our consciousness is prayer. And prayer is thinking about God. And we're told to turn entirely away from the problems and turn entirely towards God. This is what I'm saying. Don't focus on what's missing on one side of the prism. Focus on what is on the other, and then focus on removing whatever that is in the prism of consciousness that's not letting it come through. But how do we think about God? If we're going to turn our attention to God, if we're going to think about God, how do we do that? Now remember, excuse me, I often say that as human beings we can do something that, as far as we know, no other creature can do. Right? We can be aware of what we are thinking. We can reflect upon our own thoughts, and we can control our own thoughts. We can choose not to think that, but instead we'll think this. And yet that is the one thing that we as human beings probably do the least. Be original thinkers, be reflective thinkers, be thinking about what we're thinking about. And when it comes to our spiritual growth, this is entirely the key. Right? So many years ago, and even today, not so much today, but many years ago, people would lead a contemplative life. And today you can go on the internet. A couple months ago we listened to a couple of lectures by Thomas Merton, a Catholic priest, and he was talking about contemplative prayer. So there's this idea that people would go into a cloister, into a monastery, or into a convent, and they would live in very, very decluttered conditions compared to our lives today, so that they could contemplate, they could think about God all day long. Because by thinking about, by turning our attention to God, by thinking about God, we open our consciousness up to the experience of God. And it is that experience of the presence of God that produces that change in our lives that then allows that aspect of God that we had previously restricted to come through. So think of it as cleaning up the prism simply by its presence. So we turn our attention to it. So Emmet Fox tells us you could take any one aspect of God, any one whatsoever. Take the one that's easiest for you. And if you would contemplate that, if you would stay with that, eventually everything would be healed. every aspect of your life, every aspect of God would be flowing through you, flowing through your life fully, freely, and completely. So you can take any one aspect, the one that appeals to you most, and dedicate yourself to it, stay with it. And then he goes on to say, however, if we look at the areas of our lives that we consider to be problems, we can usually look at them and say, but there's one aspect of God that might apply more fully to this particular issue in my life. So if you're having discord, then perhaps harmony would be the aspect of God that you want to remember, you want to bring your attention to. And if you think what we do in spiritual mind treatment, we start out, the first step is, what do we know about God as it pertains to this issue? What do we know about God as it pertains to this issue? That's step number one of treatment. We are very deliberately choosing to bring our own consciousness to contemplate God in some particular way. That's what we're trying to do. So Emmet Fox then tells us, that what we want to do is we want to think about God. We want to think about God. And in order to think about God, we have to have this handle that I'm talking about, this suction cup, to allow us to grasp that which we could otherwise not hold. And these then are the 7 main aspects of God. Excuse me. So we want to look then briefly at his definitions of the 7 main aspects, what they are, and what conditions they might apply to. But looking at them and hearing them, that's all well and good. As I say, you can go onto the internet and you can find these lists and work with them more fully, but you have to apply them. You have to practice them. So we don't need to go into a cloister and sit in a blank cell and spend our entire day in contemplative prayer. We can if we want to. If that's our path, we certainly can do that. But we live in the world, and the world provides us with more than enough opportunities to contemplate God during the day. Just turn on the news for 5 minutes and then turn it off and think about what aspects of God were missing from that news report. See? When you have difficulty at work, if you're having struggles in your relationship, if you're having issues in your finances, if you want to do more of something, if you want, a lot of times we come into a teaching and it's about there's a problem that needs to be solved. But eventually we get to the point where there's an opportunity to be pursued. There's something to create. Right? God doesn't go around solving problems. The divine doesn't know about problems. But it knows that it wants to express, it wants to experience, it wants to enjoy. And we are the instruments of that here. So what is it that you want to express more fully in your life? What is it that you want to do more of? What is it that you want to give more of? What is it that you want to experience more of? And can you relate that to an aspect of God that you can then think about? So this contemplating these aspects of God, then what we're doing is we are attuning. Rocco Errico tells us that the Aramaic word for prayer might have been more appropriately translated as a trap or an attunement. So think about in the old days when we turned the dial on the radio receivers and you would tune in the station. That what we are doing is we are attuning our consciousness to that aspect of God. And as we attune our consciousness to that aspect of God, the presence of God, the activity of God, the awareness of God produces a change or changes within us that then allows more of that to come through. Okay? Again, I apologize for the cough. So the first aspect we want to talk about is life. And what Dr. Fox tells us is we don't want to think about God as being alive, but the very principle of life, the essence of life, that which from which all life comes. Right? Look at the diversity of life on our planet. The plants, the animals, the human beings. Life is expressing itself everywhere, everywhere. It amazes me that we can go down to the deepest part of the ocean where there is no oxygen, and we find creatures down there that have learned how to live on the hydrogen sulfide coming out of volcanic vents. We can go to Antarctica and drill down through the ice and find bacteria down there. It's been there for thousands and thousands of years. There was a piece in the news a couple of weeks ago about scientists in Russia who have dug down into the permafrost and taken out flatworms that were 40,000 years old and defrosted them, and they regained activity. They've been living in a state of suspended animation for 40,000 years. Think of this thing called life. And where does it all come from? Who is the author of that, or what is the author of that? There's just this presence, there's just this life force in the universe. So we shouldn't be surprised that on other planets and other places there are forms of life that are perfectly adapted for that environment. This is what Dr. Holmes tells us. Wherever our consciousness goes, we will cloak ourselves in a form that is perfectly adapted for that environment. Excuse me again. I apologize. So, at times we may be working with what appears to be a disease, a sickness, lack of energy, being tired, being depressed. All these things where you might say, like, I'm only half alive. Really just don't have the oomph or the vim or the vigor that I used to have. This idea that we get old, this idea of getting old, wearing down and all those things. We go back and we think about life. Life never wears out. Life never gets old. Life is never born. Life never dies. Life always is. Life always is. The second main aspect of God that we want to talk about today is truth. And this is interesting, because what is truth? We're talking about that which is. That which is absolute, that which is not relative. So much of what we see in the world today is relative truth and half truth, and people cherry picking facts to make a case while ignoring the rest of the facts. So that which is true in this idea. Now think about the perfect white light on God's side of the prism. That which is true, it is, and it's unchangeable, and it doesn't change based on conditions. It's not relative. It's not situational. It just simply is. So there is this truth then that is absolute, that is, and if you think about it in biblical terms, we're told, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." So what goes on our side of the prism is half-truths, and we're bound by them. We're bound by them, and we grow up and we expect them to be as normal. We accept them as normal. That's just the way it is, that's the way it is. You'll hear people do all kinds of things, and they say, well, that's just business, or that's just politics, or, well, that's just the way it is. So we're living in a world, our experience, we're living in a world of half-truths, of relative truths, of situational truths. And what we want to do is we want to recognize that there is one absolute truth. And we can know that. We can know what that is. We have the ability to commune with that truth, to make our contact with that truth. So if you're having a situation in your life, for example, you want to know something, you're doing research, or you need a fact, you need data, you want to know something, contemplate on God as truth and let that idea come forward through you. If you're dealing with a situation where you think somebody is being deceitful, contemplate as God as truth and know that the presence of God is within them as truth. If you're dealing with a legal document like a contract or something like that and you want to make sure you understand it, think about God as truth, and just sit and be with that. What does that mean? What is truth? Is truth revealing itself to me now and through me now? Remember, what we expect and accept as normal is what we get. Emmet Fox, in this pamphlet, he says, if you think about God, it's almost as if the Bible is saying, that God is saying to us, I will be whatever you believe me to be. That's what I'll be for you. Truth. We want to believe in God as truth. The next main aspect, and perhaps the most important one for us, is love. And I don't mean the human concept of love as being necessary relationship or a role or responsibility or physical love or all of those things. Many times in our culture we use the word love instead of an appetite. I love hamburgers, or a desire, I love that. Love is the experience of oneness, the experience of unity. And the kind of love I'm talking about is undifferentiated, unconditional love. It is an experience of oneness so complete that there's no separation between us. That is the love that I'm talking about. And that is the divine love, or the agape love, or the love of God. Every issue in our lives can be healed by love, because God is everything. God is perfect, God is whole, God is complete, God is knowledge, God is with power. We can go down that list. So whatever condition in our lives we wish to have a greater experience of, love can lead us to that. Love can dissolve the barriers that are in our way. This is Moses at the well, approaching God through love. So if you would do nothing more than sit and contemplate love, which is delightful for us, right? To sit and contemplate divine love, to be in the presence of divine love. Augustine said, love and do what you will, because when we are in the presence of that love, we can do no harm to ourselves or to another. We can do no harm. So, especially in cases where there's fear, wherever there's fear, there's an absence of love. So what is it that you're afraid of? Whatever that is, take that into your contemplation of divine love. Is love afraid of that? Is God afraid of that? What is the fear? And the fear is always going to come down to an absence of love. An absence of love. So if we could go through life and we could recognize each and every other person as being a perfect expression of God's love, and ourselves as a perfect expression of God's love, then no one could hurt us. No one would hurt us. On the other hand, Emmet Fox tells us that if we are working on a healing for something and it's not coming forth, we just need to love a little bit more. We need to love a little bit more. Number 4 is intelligence, and this is interesting because he doesn't define intelligence. So as I mentioned the other week, my definition is the ability to act appropriately. Here he's talking about harmony. Everything works together perfectly. Right? In a machine that has been intelligently designed, and remember Emmet Fox was an electrical engineer, in a machine that has been intelligently designed, there are no extra parts, there are no parts missing. I can go out into the garage and get my tool set and completely tear down the engine on a lawnmower. And when I get done, there's not going to be anything in there that doesn't need to be there. Everything is there for a purpose. It's been thought through. It's been designed. And that's what the intelligence of God is. So it's not necessarily brain power that we're talking about. It's this wisdom. It's this harmony that is flowing through. And we have to know that that is available for us. Wherever we think that there's disharmony, we have to know that the intelligence of God is. Wherever the chaos seems to be, wherever the confusion seems to be, the intelligence and the presence of God is. If you're studying, if there's something that you need to learn and you need to know, then thinking about intelligence. Right? I often tell students, when students come to me and they're nervous about a test, I always tell them, the mind that is taking the test is the mind that wrote the test. The divine mind knows everything that there is to know. It is intelligent. Let that come through. Let that come through. There is a way that we can access information that is without the constraints of logic and reason. It's called intuition. Gnosis, G-N-O-S-I-S, an inner knowing. We have to make ourselves available to that, and we have to practice. The fifth element of God that he talks about, he calls soul with a capital S. And this requires a little bit of explanation. He says soul, as he defines it, is the ability of God to individualize itself in many unique expressions, that's us, without becoming separated. Without becoming separated. We are unique, individualized expressions of that divine soul. That which we call our soul is the presence of God within us. The I am, it is sometimes referred to the Christ, the Buddha consciousness, the oneness. Now the importance of this is we have to get over the idea that we're doing everything alone. I have to do this. I have to do that. I have to make this so. No. Whenever you're feeling overwhelmed with the tasks at hand or the project at hand or whatever needs to be done, bring yourself back to say, God as me is doing it. In Christianity it says, I don't do the works, but the Father within does the works. In the Tao, it says, he who can do perfect non-doing does everything. Do you think God knows how to do this? Whatever your concept of God is. Do you think intelligence and power and wisdom, all of those things, knows how to do it? So to the degree that we can get our ego and our intellect out of the way, by focusing on God as soul, or God as expressing itself through individualized thinking centers, which we would say is us. Joel Goldsmith says, stop thinking of God in me, think of God as me. Emmet Fox says, think of God by means of me. God by means of me does this work. God by means of me builds this house or cooks this meal or drives this car or whatever it is that we have to do that we may want a little bit of extra help with. Now the point we want to make here is again, it's not just about solving problems. We're trying to get to know God by whatever is in front of us in this day. Whatever we have to do this day, there's an opportunity there for you and I to know God at a deeper level. That's what we're talking about here. Alrighty, where was I here? Number 6, spirit. Spirit. So God as spirit, think of the opposite of matter. Matter decays, matter wears out, matter is inanimate and all those things, but spirit is like life. Spirit just is. The very energy, the very energy of life. It cannot be destroyed. It wasn't born. It shall never die. God just is spirit. So, similar to the idea of soul, where God becomes individualized. Spirit is what it animates us. It is the one spirit of God. And again, there's some overlap here. So between spirit and soul, you could say they sound very similar, and they do. think of electricity, right? So I go out the front door and I look out and I can see a huge steam cloud coming up from the nuclear reactor a few miles from here. Now that electricity is the energy or the force, if you will. And it doesn't care whether it expresses itself as a light bulb or the compressor in the air conditioner. It just expresses itself. It just expresses itself. And spirit is expressing itself through us. And I think that this is another one that's most important for our growth, because we typically say things like, well, I'm only human, or well, maybe when we die and get to heaven, that will be wonderful, we'll all be spirit. But right now, we're human beings in a human world, and we have to do things the human way. We do not. We do not. We are spiritual beings. We are spiritual beings having a human experience for the purpose of discovering our spirituality, for the purpose of God experiencing itself as us and through us and discovering its beauty. Remember I said last week gratitude was a good practice? Because gratitude lets us experience and see the activity in all of these aspects of God in everything that we do. So if you're working with anything, any idea that something is damaged, something is decrepit, something is breaking down, all of those things, what you want to focus on is spirit. God as spirit is never broken down. Since I am an expression of God's spirit, I am never broken down. See? Try it. Emmet Fox says, don't argue with it, just try it. And the last one that he wants to call our attention to is what he calls principle. We might call law. Our principle is the same everywhere, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Principle is more like cause. What we see is the effect. Gravity is the principle. Water flowing downhill is the effect. And what he tells us to consider here then is that this brings us to our concept of God and our techniques of prayer. God doesn't change the rules just because you and I pray. Gravity is not suspended. If we fall out of an airplane and we say, dear God, please turn gravity off so I can get safely to the ground, gravity doesn't get turned off. Gravity is a principle. But here's the thing that we have to keep in mind. There are principles that combine and work together to counteract other principles. So the force of gravity would attract the mass of an airplane to Earth. We know that. But an airplane is able to generate another force, another principle it can work with called lift. And by using lift, it can seem to suspend gravity, but it doesn't. If you're flying in a plane, you got coffee in your cup, it stays in your cup. So what we're talking about here in these principles is there's a principle in that it is done unto us according to our belief. The power by which prayer is answered, the law of mind. And when we are doing our scientific prayer, when we are contemplating on God, we are not suspending other principles, but we are bringing ourselves into a different attunement and a different alignment with the way that God really is. And we are inviting that to express and experience itself more fully through us. So for example, if someone is sick and we're praying for the demonstration of perfect health, what we're really praying for is a demonstration of the law of mind, the principle that says when we change our belief, when we accept and expect a new normal, a different normal, instead of saying, well, X number of people are going to get sick every year, this one's just one of them. We go back and say, no, there's no such thing as sickness in the mind of God. There's no such thing as disease in the mind of God. There's only perfect health, and that perfect health is right now flowing through this individual because they are an expression of God. Now, when the healing takes place, it's not because God did us a favor. It's not because God originally decided to send sickness to this person and somehow was convinced by our pleas to change its mind. It's all working within consistency. It's all working within principle. So whenever you're engaged in treatment work or scientific prayer, whatever word you want to call it, if you're not getting results, what you want to do is go back and focus on God as principle. Maybe you think that you have to make it happen. Maybe you think that your ego or your willpower is making it happen, and you're not. No more than your ego, and you can make the light switch go on and off. Now, if you want the lights to come on, you cooperate with the principle of electricity by doing what you're supposed to do. You flick the switch. And what you're doing in your prayer life is you're flicking the switch. The flicking the switch of your consciousness. Alrighty, so those are the 7 main aspects of God as Emmet Fox wrote them in his pamphlet. As I say, if you pick up Thomas Troward's reading of them, you'll get 7 different definitions because there's an overlap and a different understanding, and words tend to get in the way. The important thing, the takeaway I hope that we get from all of this, and I realize there was a lot packed into this hour together this morning, so I invite you to go on the web and do further research. But the important thing is that we are to contemplate God. We are to turn our attention towards God. That's our spiritual growth. As we turn our attention towards God, as we make our conscious connection with the divine, that's what changes our lives. That's what changes our consciousness. Find one of those aspects of God that is more pleasing to you than the others. Now, let's say it's love, and focus on that. How can you develop a practice, a meditation practice around love? There's going to be one of those aspects that's more difficult than others. Perhaps intelligence. Perhaps there's certain people that you look at and you would say, there's no way the intelligence of God is present there. That might be the one that's difficult for you. Take time to work with that until you can understand that the intelligence of God is present there. It is present there. Okay? Find a way to make your life your spiritual practice. Find a way to make your daily activity your opportunity to contemplate the presence and the activity of God. Make it a game, Everything you do, make it a game. Oh, which aspect of God applies to this? Which aspect of God applies to that? Right? Have fun with your spiritual growth. Joy is the reason we're here. Joy. So have fun discovering God being God in all of its aspects. If somebody says they have a problem, what aspect is missing? What would it take to make that experience be whole? And in this way you'll be seeing the effect. You'll be seeing the presence and the activity of God everywhere present. And your life and your consciousness will grow, and it will change as a result. And so it is.